Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Clinton Johnson, and I use he, him pronouns. I lead Esri's Racial Equity Unified team, where we focus on delivering geospatial capabilities and providing guidance to help organizations advance racial equity and social justice. I'm joined today by my colleague, Diana Lavery. Diana uses she, her pronouns and is a product engineer on the Policy Maps team within the Living Atlas team. Today, we'll share some tips with you today on how to use GIS to jumpstart your racial equity work and to operationalize racial equity impact assessments. So I want to talk about how GIS can be applied as a framework for racial equity. And that's going to include some brief examples of how racial inequities are being handled by organizations like yours today. It's going to include providing an understanding of how the impact of decisions and policies on equity in your communities can be assessed, and an overview of the racial equity guidance and capabilities that Esri delivers. Then Diana is going to do the fun stuff and provide a demonstration of a few ways that ArcGIS can be used to assess equity. That'll include showing you how to find ready-to-use maps within the Esri Maps for Public Policy site, and how to find maps and layers within the Living Atlas, and how to use a layer from the Living Atlas to create your own map. Then we'll have some time for questions, and please use the Q&A tool throughout the webinar to submit questions early. And definitely complete the survey that pops up when you exit. We use that information to inform the next set of webinars, the ways that we deliver products and services to you differently in the future. And by the way, this webinar is recorded and will be available to all of you within a week or so. Many organizations are stepping up to do their part to address racial equity, recognizing that racial injustice is everyone's problem to address. And many also recognize the need to do that work in collaboration across sectors. And all of these commitments reflect decisions made by organizations to intentionally increase racial equity, many of which require and are explicitly themselves policy changes. And organizations and communities need to understand how their decisions in these new policies will ultimately impact equity. Racial equity is increasingly a priority for many countries across the world. And in many ways, governments recognize that racial equity and social justice has a role to play across the board. For instance, it's clear that policies and decisions related to the management of the pandemic must be equitable to address racial disparities in COVID-19 and to really more comprehensively address health equity. Economic recovery must address the long persisting racial inequities that have created and sustained poverty in many communities of color. And climate change policies must address climate and environmental justice, recognizing that historic and contemporary policies have led to racial inequities that have resulted in higher areas with higher concentrations of environmental pollutants also being areas that have higher proportions of Black and brown people. Racial disparities, like those and many more, place a higher burden on some individuals, families, and communities than others, ultimately reducing the collective capacity of every city, county, region, and country. So, of course, racial equity is very important, and it's important to have a common understanding of what it is. So let's use these flowers and the situation they find themselves in to talk about inequity. I'm sure you've all seen many diagrams like these before. The ones I'll share today were created by a group called ECOS. ECOS works to drive environmental stewardship and inspire communities to foster a sustainable future. What they've depicted here as flowers, you can think of as individuals, families, and communities situated somewhere in society, perhaps in some city, county, state, or some country. You can think of the ground the pots stand on as the foundation that those that came before them were able to provide. You can think of the fence posts between the flowers and the sun as the barriers we all face of varying kinds and of varying levels. And you can think of the sun as opportunity or resources that contribute to health, education, economic, or social outcomes. Each flower is not getting the same amount of access to sun, and over time, their health and condition will suffer in varying ways as a consequence. So someone has decided to be fair and provide the same resources for each flower. We call that equality. But ultimately, this approach isn't really fair. In fact, in this situation, it increased disparities for some, because some flowers are getting more sun than others. and one flower or community still isn't getting access to the sun at all. Some policies seek to be fair and try to provide the same resources to every person, family, or neighborhood, but a nuanced approach is needed to account for the different barriers people face. To be more fair, organizations are trying to provide resources that align with needs. They want to create policies that allocate resources to communities based on the different barriers they face. True fairness in this context is justice, the removal of all barriers, and many organizations are trying to identify policies that present barriers to some and make adjustments to ensure more justice for all. And many organizations across the country are taking the lead to drive change at a local level. With the growing number of chief equity officers stepping up to handle in this moment what many have viewed as two overlapping pandemics, trying to ensure that policies and practices across their organizations increase equity. Many cities, counties, some states, and the American Public Health Association have declared racism as a public health crisis. Many of you are likely working or living in some of these jurisdictions and may be called upon to produce decision-making tools to inform more racial equity in policies that impact resources and conditions that ultimately impact health. And so many of you and your colleagues are working to understand and unravel the broad range of racial inequities that plague communities worldwide, creating resources to inform policymakers and to help mobilize resources to create real change. And we recognize that these inequities are complex and they create a wide range of experiences and outcomes for people across many different communities. And policies play a huge role in how people fare. And very often we find ourselves focusing on the outcomes when thinking of inequities. Outcomes of policies that people experience, like disparities in chronic health conditions and food security, infant mortality rates and birth outcomes, workplace equity and employment status. Racial equity best practices, though, they recognize that there is a relationship between disparities in outcomes and disparities in community assets and conditions that ultimately contribute to those outcomes. And root cause analysis best practices recognize that inequities in outcomes and community conditions and assets flow from decisions and practices, those policies taking place, decisions being made further upstream. And the goal is, of course, in part to assess and address unhealthy streams, but also to identify, uplift, and amplify decisions and practices, the policies that lead to community assets that drive positive outcomes. Now, this model was heavily influenced by the work of King County in Washington and Race Forward. And in this model, outcomes are the indicators of how people fare. That is to say, how individuals, families, communities, how they fare socially in terms of health, education, and economically. And outcomes include things like educational attainment, prevalence and severity of chronic disease, and many other social, economic, and health and education outcomes. Community assets and conditions are the circumstances and the resources surrounding individuals, families, and communities where they live, where they work, where they play, and where they travel. Community assets and conditions include circumstances like access to quality health care, to parks, to recreation, housing and environmental conditions, and many other conditions across a wide range of concerns. And decisions and practices are the policies, programs, systems, messaging, and budget decisions that influence the circumstances surrounding individuals, families, and communities that ultimately impact how they fare. And they include policies that are historic and contemporary, made by governments, businesses, and communities. And these policies may either create or sustain or simply not do enough to address structural racism or other forms of discrimination, biased against or for people based on class, gender, or other social groupings, inequitable distributions of resources or power, and intergenerational inequities that are really a summation of all of the above, impacting multiple generations of families or communities over time. And Like I said, this model helps us to understand and address the root causes of social inequities, including racial injustice. So let's apply it a bit. So if we look at St. Louis, Missouri, where families and communities face a history of discrimination based on race, immigration status, and other social identities due to policies like redlining and racial covenants. Redlining and segregation has been linked to temperatures in neighborhoods. This map aligns an analysis of temperatures on a particular day in the summer of 2019. It aligns them with HOLC grades from historic redlining policies. The bluer areas are cooler and the warmer areas are red. So let's focus on this grade A area. Looking closely, we see that this area that was graded A or best was one of the coolest areas in St. Louis at the time. These cooler temperatures have been linked to high tree coverage and vegetation. On the other hand, this area that was graded as D or hazardous was one of the warmest areas, which was of course linked to lower tree coverage and less vegetation, but also to higher proportions of paved surfaces. This disparity in temperatures leads to higher energy bills, negative impacts on chronic health conditions, and higher preterm births. And according to the CDC, urban heat islands have a deadly impact on cities like St. Louis and Baltimore and many others. Moreover, the number of heat wave days has been increasing in many cities across the country. And the CDC says that causes of death related to heat include things like heat stroke, respiratory disease, and more. And heat islands and heat waves have been correlated to increases in hospitalizations for cardiovascular, kidney, and respiratory disorders. Moreover, extreme heat events are expected to increase in frequency and intensity across the US for decades to come. So again, this can help identify unhealthy streams, but the ultimate goal is to inform the design of healthy streams. And GIS provides a wide and growing array of techniques and tools to help organizations understand and unravel interrelated concerns that create barriers to equality and ultimately design a future where all communities can be served equitably. Today, you're going to get a preview of some of the ways that you can explore and visualize data that will help you to assess the impact of your policies on equity. Over time, we've evolved this guidance to help organizations essentially apply GIS as a framework for racial equity. And that begins with guidance for applying a racial equity lens. As we all know, race and place matters. And as I said before, Esri provides data, tools, and guidance to help you apply a racial equity lens to the community assets, conditions, and outcomes that people are experiencing across your communities. Organizations are trying to apply a multifaceted, intersectional racial equity lens to examine and address disparities. And racial equity lenses include race and ethnicity, religion, language, country of origin, nationality, immigration status, and moreover, those factors intersect with other social characteristics, including gender, sexual orientation, age, ability, and characteristics that convey the sense of social or economic class like income, home ownership, and more. And all of which either impact or is impacted by where people live, work, play, or travel. And we provide resources and guidance to help folks apply an intersectional, multifaceted racial equity lens to assess overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination like racism, anti-Semitism, classism, xenophobia, homophobia, and more. And as you'll see today, Esri provides access to a lot of spatial data to help organizations explore, understand, and tackle these issues. You can also integrate GIS with best practice workflows for advancing racial equity and social justice. This racial equity workflow is a critical aspect of how you can apply GIS as a framework for racial equity. It was derived from emerging and best practices for advancing racial equity and social justice that we've just seen all of your organizations execute. And we've simply infused those standard and emerging practices with best practices for GIS and location intelligence. So organizations working towards racial equity need to inform, be informed by, and collaborate with stakeholders both in and outside of their organization. So engaged communities is at the core of this workflow to support your ongoing efforts to increase awareness, understanding, and collaboration at every stage of the process. So we encourage folks to deploy the racial equity community outreach solution to enable your organizations to engage stakeholders around focus initiatives and key metrics, use surveys and crowdsourcing apps to ground truth your understanding of needs, and use tools like story maps to share a complete narrative that helps you to put the issues that you're trying to address in context with the solutions that you're trying to implement. Organizations working to advance racial equity are trying to proactively seek out racial inequities, identify community assets that increase equity and opportunity, identify clear goals and objectives and measurable outcomes, all the while engaging the community in the process. So for the first stage of the workflow, we have map and analyze equity, meaning apply that intersectional, multifaceted racial equity lens to reveal and understand inequities, to locate populations of concern, and identify barriers to equality and opportunities for more equity. So when we look at any of these phases, there are always some steps that are aligned to the core phase, as well as some activities that you want to do to engage communities. So when it comes to map and analyze equity, this typically starts with some initial assessment and or scope, some understanding that communities are experiencing disparities in outcomes or community conditions, or otherwise experiencing the impacts of systemic or structural discrimination. In some sense of where you want to focus. Is it at the city level, neighborhood levels, or certain neighborhoods? And organizations need to engage the community from the beginning. They need to be able to validate their understanding of issues alongside the folks who are facing them. Next comes data assessment and curation, meaning identifying data needed to support effective analysis, curating data from available sources, and gathering new data as needed. And organizations need to engage partners, other organizations that may have additional data resources, including those organizations that can expand your ability to collect authoritative data from the community. And with data resources at hand, in alignment with community and partners, organizations can more effectively assess equity. And of course, organizations will need to continue to validate their understanding and ground truth that understanding with the community hand in hand. So at this stage, you can use, as you'll see today, Esri's Living Atlas to find data resources to help enrich your own data sets. You can use the community analyst or business analyst tools to produce infographics that help you to explore your communities. You can find training resources in the Racial Equity Hub to help you to get started or to take on challenging scenarios. And you can work with tools that you may already have, like Urban, to assess equity within your jurisdictions. So with an understanding of where inequities are impacting populations of concerns, organizations then seek to infuse their efforts with racial equity and social justice best practices. And what we mean by that is organizations are trying to make sure that their programs and their services are distributed equitably. They're also trying to make sure that any interventions that they're providing, any policy work they're doing, will really create real change. So in the operationalized best practices stage, this is where organizations are looking to design and plan equitable allocations of resources to alleviate burdens on populations of color. So we encourage users to leverage ArcGIS in all of its flavors to identify more equitable allocations of resources, to automate work, including the work of your teams on the ground, to inform decisions using the right configurations of products, solutions, and data, and really to embed equity directly into your existing workflows, again, using tools like Urban, to review policy changes or development proposals to ensure that equity will be the result of any new change. And finally, organizations need to ensure that their efforts to increase equity are having the impact they seek. So in the managed performance stage, organizations use decision-making tools to visualize racial inequities at a glance to adapt their strategies and operations dynamically to increase equity. So use maps and dashboards to assess the impact of your efforts and identify more opportunities to increase equity. Compare your workforce, volunteers, the people receiving services from your jurisdictions to the community at large, and go beyond race and look at population groups in a nuanced way to more effectively assess and support the most disadvantaged. And apply the same concepts to explore amenities, conditions, and outcomes within your communities. So, of course, your organizations are going to find yourselves in the middle of operationalizing best practices or managing performance at this very moment. And undoubtedly, you'll need to repeat this cycle periodically around any given initiative, program, or service. Just know that you can hop into this cycle at any stage and just keep moving through it to maximize your impact. And to support your efforts to automate your practices, you can leverage product and solution configuration guidance. We recognize that leaders across the globe are challenged with addressing racial equity and work happening across their organizations. They need tools and resources at their fingertips to inform decisions and actions to ensure that their work is creating benefits for marginalized communities and not burdens. So we're delivering solutions that align with your organizational workflows, as well as guidance for how to configure the products that you may already have, so that your GIS teams can deliver the right maps and apps to the right leaders at the right time. And finally, there's an envisioning process for enterprise-wide racial equity initiatives. We understand that many leaders, including a growing list of racial equity leads, are working to organize and oversee racial equity related initiatives and drive impact across their entire enterprise. So we're making available resources to facilitate the understanding of priorities, impact, and scope in a structured manner to create geospatial strategies that align with leaders, to help orchestrate the delivery of geospatial capabilities to drive racial equity throughout your communities. And this envisioning process is derived largely from the work of organizations like Race Forward that help organizations like yours develop racial equity action plans. So as you can see, Esri provides comprehensive GIS and location and intelligence resources to support a broad range of racial equity and social justice initiatives. In many ways, these resources reflect emerging and best practices for advancing racial equity and social justice that leaders in your organizations have been working on and have been executing for so many years. And we intend to continue to evolve the guidance and the capabilities that we provide, just as your needs and your efforts to address racial equity and social justice continue to evolve. So today, where we'll focus the most is around map and analyze equity. And Diana is about to show you some really compelling capabilities. So now that I've done my part, talked about how you can apply GIS as a framework for racial equity, you'll hear from Diana, who will demonstrate a few ways that you can use ArcGIS to assess equity.
Thanks, Clinton. Well, here we are at the Esri Maps for Public Policy site. This is a great resource that I'll walk you through for doing racial equity impact assessments. Now, you may or may not have heard that phrase, but maybe you've heard of a fiscal impact assessment or an environmental impact assessment, where it's at the proposal stage, you're saying, what will the impact be of this policy that I'm proposing? So if we go to the Explore tab, we'll be able to see some good maps. Say we're interested in the Phoenix area. Let's go there. And there are all different types of categories here within this policy map site. Out of the 682 maps, that's a growing collection of maps every day, this number is growing. They've been categorized into different topics. The one, of course, we'll focus on today is racial inequity. However, racial equity is embedded in transportation, in sustainability, and in a lot of these. So maps have definitely been cross-tagged and they're able to be discovered in a lot of different ways. All right, so in Phoenix, let's look and see. This one looks interesting. I'll view it. it's showing me home ownership among Hispanic and Latino versus non-Hispanic white households. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there were home ownership foreclosure protections that went into effect. And I know a lot of you racial equity leads are probably already thinking, well, the racial makeup of homeowners is not the same as the racial makeup of renters. So from a racial and social justice perspective, who's benefiting from such a policy and who is not? Here we can see these two groups. We're using a mapping style called compare A to B, and what that does is it shows where the ratio is close to 1 in this white color, and then the brighter colors where there's more of a disparity. So here, for example, if we see the pop-up that comes with a lot of these maps, we'll see, okay, homeownership here is actually higher for Hispanic and Latino households. And if we scroll down, we actually get a chart of all different racial groups in terms of their homeownership. Like I mentioned, if it's a little bit lighter, the ratio is closer to 1, meaning not so much of a difference in homeownership rates. I really like this map, so I'll add it to my collection here. And continuing on, race and ethnicity with the lowest median income. That looks interesting too. My map stays zoomed into Phoenix, which is the community that I'm interested in. And this uses what we call a predominance map, where we're not only just mapping 2 attributes, in this case, we're mapping 8 and seeing where, which group in these census tracts has the lowest median household income. Let's look at this pop-up, and it gives us a little bit more information. All right, I'll add this to my collection as well. Let's view this one. Where are Hispanic and Latino populations without health insurance? Interesting. This is what we call a color and size map, where the color shows us the percentage and the size of the symbol shows us the count of people affected by this. So here, the darker purple, a lower percentage, and medium-sized count. This one over here is bright orange, so very high percentage and high count. Let's take a look at this pop-up. All right, and again, we get a nice bar graph of a lot more racial groups. So I'll add this to my collection as well. And you can see that now I've got 3 maps in my collection that I can toggle through. And again, the map stays zoomed in to Phoenix, even though a lot of these are national maps in terms of their coverage overall. What I'm really interested in is the Phoenix area. So it's going to and we can take a look at some of these other maps here. I won't go through all of them. There's quite a few, but one of our most popular ones is simply just what is the most common race and ethnicity. Let's view this one. Using this map to overlay things with, or things like libraries or pharmacies, other community assets, just doing that alone can be really illuminating, show where there are some inequities at play. So just because one tract is a particular color, it means that it is the most predominant group, but you can see there are definitely other people there as well. So I'll add this to my collection as well, why not? So now I can go through these 4 different maps. I can share this collection on social media. Since I'm signed in up here to ArcGIS Online, I can add all 4 of these maps to my favorites and use the maps right into a story map or a dashboard or a hub site or something like that. But another way that I like to share these maps is simply by good old-fashioned email. And um, what you'll see is just the link in terms of what they'll be able to see is this exact collection zoomed into Phoenix. It's got all 4 of the map titles, and you can embed this into your own organization's website, share it with your coworkers and your stakeholders, and it's a great way to share these maps. All right, a lot of these maps are powered by data layers in the Living Atlas. And before I move on, I want to go to a poll actually and see how familiar everyone is with Living Atlas. So let's get the poll up. All right, so it looks like a lot of people have heard of it, but haven't used it themselves. Some people are pretty familiar with it. Okay, well, what the Living Atlas is it's GIS content, essentially. Um, Ready to use, ready to jumpstart your own GIS work. And in terms of some great topics at hand, you can just type in a topic such as air quality, for example. And let's see how we can filter to get some really good results. We're interested in the United States in this case, and perhaps we're interested in story maps and apps, that final information product to see what other people have done on this topic. Or maybe we're interested in ready-to-use maps that I can just plug into my own story map. Perhaps we're interested in layers that we want to bring into our own workflow. We can see that a lot of these are by the EPA. This one looks like it's by NOAA. And there's 20 different results for layers within the United States on air quality. Other topics that you might be interested in are health professional shortage areas, otherwise known as HPSAs. There are mental health HPSAs, dental, primary care, and more. Let's take a look at the dental one. And every Living Atlas layer is fully documented so that any questions you might have, you can see, okay, what exactly am I looking at here? So here is a dental health professional shortage area, and this can be used to overlay with your own city's data sets that you might be working with. We've got a lot of great maps and layers from the CDC as well. We also have some of our most popular layers are current ACS, which is American Community Survey from the Census Bureau. These were the layers powering those maps that you saw in the Policy Map site. So let's take a look here. All right. There's within any one of these layers, there's all kinds of great attributes. The one we'll be looking at today is internet access by age and race. Let's take a look. Again, we get that fully documented item details page that's coming up, and I'll show you how to look for the fields themselves. So if we click on data here, we can get the attribute table, but where I really like to live is on the fields tab. So let's go there, and we just get a list of all the 183, in this case, fields available to us. And it actually tells us a little bit of a definition. So households that have no computer. Well, what exactly is meant by computer or computing device? Tells us that that includes a desktop or a laptop. A smartphone even is considered a computer in this data set. Tablet or other portable computer. So that's really good to know. These same categories continue with age breakdowns and race and ethnicity breakdowns, which we'll be using in our map. So back to that overview page, I can add it to a new map or map viewer beta, which I'll touch on at the end. I can add it into other products as well. But let's start with a blank map. I search to Phoenix. If you're working within your map, say you're already in the map viewer, I want to add Living Atlas layers directly in here. We can browse Living Atlas from here as well. And the great thing about this is we can say only show content within the map area. So if you don't have information for Phoenix right now, I'm not interested. So I'll search that ACS internet by race. Here we go. We can view that same item details page without even leaving the map viewer. Let's add it to the map. So we talked about access in terms of things like libraries or pharmacies, but in our digital world, access means broadband, but it really does mean having a device, because if you don't have a device, you can't really access the broadband itself. So we'll be looking at groups that don't have any computer. First thing I want to do is change the base map, because now I don't have those labels that can orient me to the cities at hand. I'll use human geography is a good base map to use because it's very neutral and it shows the cities and the highways as well. So great, now we get those labels back on our map. Let's see what this is mapping. Okay, it's mapping percent of population in this age group with no computer. Well, I'd actually like to change that and show the percent of Hispanic and Latino households with no computer, or excuse me, population in households with no computer. And again, if I have a question about what exactly is meant by this attribute, clicking on this I information button, I get that same description. It comes through within the map viewer as well. And we can read again, this includes a smartphone. All right, since we're mapping a percent, this traditional color, filled polygon color look is a great way to go for percents and rates. If we're mapping counts, such as counts of people or counts of households, size is probably more appropriate. But we'll stick with color here. And you might notice that we have a continuous color ramp. You might have seen maps where there's maybe 4 or 5 different shades of orange, and one shade of orange stands for a whole range of different values. We actually like to use a continuous color ramp for things that are continuous. Like in this example here, the percentage is a continuous variable. So we'll use color ramps such as this. We also have color ramps that start at a really nice, very neutral gray, and then they only get full color at the very extremes at the top of our values. That can be really helpful to show where the need is greatest. Let's use that blue here. We see that the average here is 6. One standard deviation above gives us 19, but we can set this wherever we want and say we're really curious and just exploring our map. The map responds in real time as we drag and drop these breakpoints. I'm going to set this to 1 down here and 25. That looks great. All right, let's click OK. Symbology looks good. We're now mapping an attribute that we care about. Let's look at the pop-up. Okay, this is the pop-up from the original layer, and it's got a chart of age groups and then race groups here. All right, we want to modify this. Let's go to Configure Pop-up. And some of you GIS analysts might already know this, but for the benefit of those who are brand new to this, the natural text here we can add to it and say whatever we want. And then the curly braces denote the fields. So we're going to add the field that we're using right there. And now we can bold this. We probably don't need this information. And let's use this to really make our case and say, these people will have trouble accessing, and we can use a bulleted list, distance learning, telehealth, information about their stimulus check, information about testing and vaccines, and job search resources, etc. All right, remember those two charts that we saw in the original pop-up? We can modify those here. This one is that one that's by age. Let's just get rid of that one. And so we'll make sure that this one is the one by race. Perfect. Okay, let's take a look at this pop-up. Looks good. All right, I'm gonna save this map and I'll give it a title that is going to be a little bit of a question. We'll say, where are Hispanic and Latino populations with no computer? And this really gets us away from the tabular data type of phrase of internet access by age, by race. It's like, no. We're really focusing our map with the symbology and with the pop-ups. So let's focus our title as well. Now, we can hand this off to our decision makers, but just as you probably would try to like format a spreadsheet or a Word doc a little bit while you're sharing it, we can do the same here by putting it into a configurable app or sharing it on our own website. So once I share it with everyone, this embed in website pops up. We get the social media buttons here. Say we want to embed this map in our organization's website. We want a legend. We don't want a scale bar. We can play with this stuff, but really we can copy this straight into our web page and this map will be embedded there. Let's put it into a configurable app as well. These are templates that allow your map to have a very focused experience. So say I want to compare two different areas, for example, or I want to create a list of the top 10 or the top 20 places most in need, or there's all different types of templates and experiences that we can show our map through. So I'll use minimalist just for now. We'll go to create, and with no coding whatsoever, we'll be able to place our web map in a really polished and presentable web app that we can share with our stakeholders. All right, so we've got the map we want to display. Next, we want the pop-up panel, and that looks good. Do we want to enable search? We might, but I really want them to focus on Phoenix, so you'll see that that search bar goes away. And just a few other options, but you get the sense that this is going to be a very interactive web app that I'll be able to share and tweet out just with the URL here. Let me show you what this looks like. Our pop-up comes through in the side panel, and so there's no scrolling down and trying to see the full graph. It shows up right there in the side panel. So that's one way to go from map to app very, very quickly. These will show up in your item content. There we go. This is a web mapping application, and this is a web map. And I mentioned at the beginning Map Viewer Beta. I want to show you a few different tips and tricks and really exciting features that are coming in Map Viewer Beta, since this will come out of beta in the next few weeks. All right, so one thing that I really like is in the styles option. The color ramps have been tagged for best for light backgrounds, best for dark backgrounds. So I mentioned before that some of them start with a gray and then they only get the full color when it's really, really high. Well, the dark backgrounds have that as a very, very dark gray. So your map will look really vibrant. Another exciting feature is we have colorblind friendly tagged color ramps. So that can be really exciting if you're interested in that. And there's way more really nice functionality in Map Viewer Beta. One about from customers is sometimes I just need to print my map as a PDF. Well, now in Map Viewer Beta, we have a lot more options for you to include a legend, with this resources tab back on the policy map site. This is filled with all kinds of videos and blog posts and tutorials for you to get started, not only using this site, but also doing your own policy mapping as you're going to be doing in your racial equity impact assessments. And one resource that I really like is up here, different mapping needs throughout a policy maps, or excuse me, throughout a policy's life cycle. And it just shows, how mature are you in your policy that you are working on? Is it in the proposal stage here, or is it a very established type of policy? The more upstream, the better, as Clinton was discussing earlier, in terms of doing that racial equity impact assessment. The best time to start was at the inception of the program that you're designing, but the second best time to start is today. Don't wait until we're 80 or 90 years past redlining when we're all the way over here doing evaluation and saying, wow, this actually caused a lot of harm. If we do these racial equity impact assessments early on, we can really mitigate the risk and actually help people. And a great way to jumpstart that type of work is through the Policy Map site and Living Atlas. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Clinton.
Thanks, Diana. That was a really great demonstration of how you can start to use ArcGIS to really, like you said, jumpstart your racial equity impact assessment, particularly focused on policies. And you may be wondering how you can get started yourself. So we've got resources to help you, if you already have GIS and you just need a template to get started, you can deploy some of our ready-to-use solutions. For those that are using GIS but need some additional help getting data, getting some apps, or getting some training, learn lessons, we can refer you to the Maps for Public Policy. You can go to the Esri Racial Equity GIS Hub and define resources. And if you need additional assistance, you can consider using a Jumpstart program using Esri's professional services resources. Reach out to your Esri rep to buy some additional licenses or to engage with your professional services team, or even just to set up a discovery call. We love to talk to new racial equity leads and to other leaders and organizations who are looking to tackle racial equity across their org. So things can sometimes get started really well with a great conversation. And we definitely would like to invite all of you that are already using GIS for racial equity work to share your stories. And maybe this might be a good time to, just before we go into questions, to ask all of you, what are you already doing to use GIS? And if you got a story to share, we'll drop a link that you can use to submit your own story and help encourage other folks who are on a similar journey to get started.
All right, I'm going to jump in and look at some of the questions we have coming in today. And while I do that, feel free to fill out the poll that's on your screen. Okay, one person mentioned that they have seen the racial equity focused learn lessons, and they were wondering, there's 4 on the website now, are there going to be more coming?
Yes, we have a pretty robust schedule plan for racial equity learning resources. So be on the lookout for some lessons that'll pop up between now and this month, May. I think we may have something slated for June, and we're always looking for more ideas and more scenarios. So if you have a great question you want to get answered, propose it to us. We'll see what we can do. If you're doing something pretty interesting and compelling with GIS to address equity, share it with us, and maybe we can get some of that turned into learning resources for others.
Great, thank you. Another person, actually a couple people asked this question. Someone said this mapping is very robust. There seems to be a wealth of available data. However, they're curious about the availability of data at the county and city level. Someone asked if the neighborhood level was available for any of this data.
Yeah, a lot of the Living Atlas layers are multi-scale, meaning that if you zoom in really far, you'll see the census tracts, which are sometimes thought of as neighborhoods. If you zoom out, you'll see counties, and then if you zoom out even further, you see states. So that can help to see how is my county doing in relation to my whole state or something like that. So yeah, you'll see a lot of multi-scale nature to the layers available in Living Atlas.
Great, thank you for answering that question. And this question actually came in that I think would be great to speak to. Do you need GIS expertise to select and use some of the map tools shared?
Not really. I mean, smart mapping and the way that ArcGIS Online and Living Atlas have been created, we try to make it as easy as possible. Even just selecting the default, you'll get a pretty decent map. However, once your expertise does grow, you'll be able to fine tune it a lot and play with some of the controls or the breakpoints, things like that. You'll learn by doing. A lot of software is like that. I don't know, Clinton, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. If you know how to use the web, it's like another web app to add to the another website to add to your mix. And as you bump into challenges or you want to accelerate that learning, there are a lot of resources available for either for existing customers with web courses that'll help you get started with some easy things or take on some more challenging issues, or the learn lessons that are freely available to any and everyone. And you can find those at learnarcgis.com. If I got that URL right, maybe someone can share.
I think it's learn.arcgis.com. I think we can, well, I'll put it in the chat.
Great. And someone also asked if you can create custom regions with multiple cities and or counties. Can you speak to that?
I think the answer to that is yes.
A
I thought maybe
nationwide
you were.
map and then a bookmark? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I was, it's like maybe I had to think about some scenarios that might align with the question. Certainly, you can compile a number of geographies and clip out the rest or filter out the rest, and so you can focus on specific areas. You can merge those geographies if that is of value to you, if that's a part of that question. There's lots of things you can do to zoom in, zoom out, scale up, scale down, focus in, carve out into sharp relief just the areas that you're focused on.
Yeah, I mean, a really easy way to do that is to make one either nationwide map or statewide map and then set bookmarks within that map. And those bookmarks travel into story maps and web apps, like you saw, where you can say, okay, now I want to show Phoenix, and then later on I want to show Flagstaff, or whatever the case may be. With those bookmarks set in the same web map, you'll be able to play around with different locations. That could be another option.
Great, thank you. And looks like we have only a few minutes left, so I don't think we're going to get to all the questions, but we'll try for a few more. Someone was asking about sending a configurable app onto a website, and then if you're able to do that, and if so, what happens when the underlying data gets updated?
Ooh, that's a great question. Yes, you are able to embed configurable apps onto your own organization's website, and excuse me, yes, the data behind, especially the American Community Survey layers and some other layers within Living Atlas, is updated as soon as that data is made available from the source. So in the case of ACS, it's every December. So your map will always show the most current data that's available. You don't have to rebuild your web map. We do recommend checking your web map and seeing if the breakpoints you set still make sense given the new values, but you are 95% of the way there once that new data comes out, because you've already built the web map and the app, and the data is now displayed when it's updated on the layer.
Great, thank you, Diana. I think we probably only have time for one more question. And there are a lot of good ones here. Someone asked, is this data that's available on the Living Atlas available in ArcGIS Pro?
Yeah. You can open it in Pro from the web. You can also, within ArcGIS Pro, you can search Living Atlas layers when you're signed in to your ArcGIS Online account and get it, access it via Pro itself. But yeah, either way, you can go from the web and then open it in Pro, or from Pro and access it through the web.
Thank you. And really quickly, I would ask too, some people ask this, if you have an ArcGIS Online subscription, does any of this data cost extra that you showed in terms of credits or other costs, or is it available?
That's another great question. All the data I showed today is available credit-free. It is publicly available data, so it's not credit consuming. Things like premium data sets or geo-enrichment, if you're choosing the exact variables you want for your own custom area, that will consume credits. But anything that I showed today, anything that's basically public information from the beginning, like the census data or CDC data, those health professional shortage areas, those are all government data sets, so there's no credit consumption for them.
Great, thank you so much for answering those questions. And we are at the hour, so unfortunately can't answer any more, but we'll try to follow up with folks after for the other questions that we didn't get to. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. That's all we have time for today. You'll be receiving an email with a link to the recording and slides sometime probably in the next week. It takes a second to get that all processed. And a quick reminder to please fill out the survey that will appear on your screen once you exit the webinar. And thank you. Visit go.esri.com/racial equity to stay connected to future opportunities like this and other resources. Thanks, everybody. Have a safe week.